Hey folks, today we're going to talk about taxonomy. So what is taxonomy? Well, taxonomy is the classification of living things. It's how we categorize living organisms based on their physical and chemical characteristics. Some of the physical characteristics that you might look at when classifying organisms are their bone structure, how they develop, their size, and things like that. Some of the chemical characteristics that you might look at are DNA and RNA, the different proteins in the body, any kind of chemicals like hormones, and other things like that. You might wonder why we classify organisms. Well, we do that to answer those big questions that people have thought about over the years, such as how many kinds of living things are there? Or what characteristics define each kind of living thing? And also, what are the relationships among different living things? There are 8 levels of classification. Starting with the biggest, all the way over here to the right, is the domain. There are only 3 domains that cover all living things. This is a pretty large group. In fact, it's the biggest group among all of the levels. As you go down, we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Species is the smallest and most specific level of classification. We can also think of it as like a pyramid chart, but the pyramid's upside down. So we have domain up here at the top. As you can see, that is the largest level. And we go down all the way to species, which is the smallest level. There are a handful of mnemonic devices that you can memorize in order to memorize the order of the levels of classification. My favorite is Did King Philip Come Over from Great Spain? So where did stands for domain, king stands for kingdom, Philip stands for phylum, come stands for class, over stands for order, from is for family, great is for genus, and Spain is for species. So what's in a scientific name? Scientists used to, way back in the day, use 12 names to name an organism scientifically. Luckily for us, in the 1700s, this guy named Carolus, also known as Carl, Linnaeus, simplified the process down to just 2 names. This 2-part naming process is called binomial nomenclature. The first part of the name is a genus, which consists of species that are similar to each other. So for example, Felis would be a genus, which consists of all cats who cannot roar, they can only purr. Species is the second part of the scientific name. This is a group of organisms that are closely related, are able to mate and produce offspring that are fertile. One example would be the Felis domesticus, domesticus here being the species. This is just the common house cat. So in the scientific name, we always include the genus and then the species. The first letter of the genus is always capitalized. Everything else is always lowercase, and we always write it in either italicized or we underline. As I said before, there are 3 domains that cover all living organisms. Those 3 domains are Eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. Eukarya consists of all of the organisms that are eukaryotes. Or in other words, they're all the organisms that have a nucleus in their cells. The second domain is bacteria, which consists of prokaryotes, which are organisms that don't have a nucleus. And these bacteria live in normal environments usually, such as soil, water, and then the human body. Our last domain is archaea, which consists of prokaryotes, again no nucleus, that live in very harsh environments, such as in hot springs or thermal vents. As we go down the pyramid of classification, kingdom is our next level of classification after domain. So if we look at the domain Eukarya, there are 4 kingdoms: animals, plants, fungus, and protists. Animals are multicellular. They don't have cell walls. They usually can move around, and they eat other organisms to get their food. Plants are also multicellular, but they have cell walls and can't move around, and they make their own food, usually through photosynthesis. Fungus could be multi or single-celled. It has cell walls, but it doesn't have chloroplasts, so it can't make its own food. It can't move, and in order to eat, it absorbs food from surrounding materials. And finally, the protists is kind of a miscellaneous category. They're single-celled or very simple multicellular organisms that could have animal, plant, or fungus-like characteristics, but they don't necessarily fit into one of the other 3 categories. categories. There's a couple of ways that scientists like to illustrate how organisms are related. One very important one is the branching diagram, also known as the cladogram. This shows a relationship among different species by grouping the organisms by common characteristics. So if an organism on your cladogram branches off before a characteristic that's listed, then it does not have that characteristic. However, if it branches off after that characteristic is listed on the graph, then it does have that characteristic. So for example here, we have the fish. The only trait it has that's on this list is a backbone. It does not have lungs. A salamander, though, has lungs and a backbone. And as we go further up the scale, you can see a mouse has fur, claws, lungs, and a backbone. But when we go to chimpanzee, you also add opposable thumbs. In order to identify organisms, we use something called a dichotomous key. That's just a series of paired statements that can help you to figure out what an organism is based on its characteristics. You always start with number 1 on the key, and then choose which paired statement best describes the organism. Once you decide which statement best fits the organism, follow the directions attached to that statement until you land on a name for the organism. So say we're looking at leaf A here. We start with number 1. Does it have needle leaves or non-needle leaves? I don't see any needles on that leaf, so it says to go to step 3. We go down to step 3. Is it a simple leaf, which is just a single leaf, or is it compound leaves, which are made of little leaflets? I would call that a simple leaf. So now it says to go to step 4. We go down there. Does it have a smooth edge or a jagged edge? I would say that's a pretty smooth edge, so go to step 5. And step 5 asks again, is it a smooth edge or are there some jagged parts to the edge? And I would call that a smooth edge, so that must be a magnolia leaf. We could also look at this in a flowchart form. So this says just the same thing that we saw before.